So this is the video on surveys. This is going to be a really important video. I want you to take good notes. I want you to pay attention. And please open the PowerPoint that's accompanying this lecture. This is going to be information that you're going to be using, and you're going to be using it soon. And it's going to have a big impact on your grade because of your research projects. Of course, we have two sections of this class. I think both sections are going to be doing surveys. And we're saying that, but let's talk for a minute about what a survey really is and how a survey is constructed. First, let's begin with just a little bit of review. As we said, we have now completed two sections of the textbook. So we've looked at some of those foundations, and we've looked at some of the planning. Now we're getting down to the real hands-on research work, right? In this third part, we're going to start looking at survey research, unobtrusive research, qualitative field research, and experimental research. Now, your textbook also covers evaluative research, but we're not going to cover it in this class. Okay, if you want to read about it, please do. It's still fair game for quiz and test questions. All right. So today we're looking at survey research, and our topics are going to be what exactly is a survey. We're going to look at how to write survey questions, which is a true art. We're going to look at different types of surveys, including questionnaires, interview surveys, telephone surveys, and online surveys. And we're going to be looking at secondary research, perhaps just a little bit, but for the most part, I'm going to cover that as I cover unobtrusive research in a coming lecture. So what is a survey? And we use survey all the time. I've used survey in both sections, and we've talked about you all doing a survey, and none of you have said, now, what exactly do you mean when you say survey? And we need to make sure that we're all looking at the same thing. Survey is basically a process. It is not the piece of paper. It is the process of asking a series of questions that will give you data, information, that you believe is representative and reflects the area that you are researching. Now, it's a vague area, and it's frequently confused with other things that look a lot like surveys. Most specifically, they're confused with polls, but polls are a very different thing. Here's the difference. Let's say that you went to my alma mater, Oklahoma State, the Friday before a football game, and you put something in the hall that says, honk if you think the Cowboys are going to win. And you could count those honks. You know, every time there's a honk, you count that number and count the number of people, and you can kind of get a feel for whether or not people think the Cowboys are going to win. On that campus before the football game, do you think there's any chance that the answer is going to be that people think they're not going to win? Of course not. That's not how it works, because the Cowboys are going to win, right? But even if the odds are against them, the fact is that that's not a scientific question. It's a biased question, and it's set in a biased area. Polls can do that, right? You can put a poll on your Yamaha website and ask about how much you like Hondas, and the answer is going to look like Hondas suck, right? Surveys, on the other hand, are scientific. They're more in depth. They don't ask a question or even a couple of questions. They ask several questions with a sample that is random, Remember what that means from the last one? It means that every member of the population has an equal chance of being included in the sample. So they are more precise, more in depth, and more scientific. And because they have those characteristics, they are more reliable and more valid. So we can trust a survey much more than a poll. Okay? Now, just in case someone asks, yes, there are scientific polls. You see them in presidential elections. Yes, you can probably trust them, at least most of them. They're still not surveys. Okay. Now, as we said, a survey is usually a set of questions. And so, since it's made up of questions, creating those questions is one of the major tasks when it comes to conducting a survey. Not the only major task. You've still got to identify who you're going to ask the question to, and of course there's the analysis afterwards, and a lot of other things to be considered. But question construction is what everyone wants to jump on. So let's talk about that just a little bit. The first thing you have to know is that questions should always represent something that has been operationalized. Your question should always result in a measurement or something that can be measured. Sometimes the best way to operationalize something is to begin to refine that as you're writing that question. So, for example, if you all want to ask a question about how happy your respondents are with something, just asking, how happy are you with this, isn't really going to get you very much information. But you could ask questions like, how many times in the last week have you done this thing? How many times in the next week do you plan to do this thing? If you could do it more often, would you want to? See, all of those are measurable. Yes or no. I did it 6 times. I did it 13 times, right? Measurements. Those are specific. Happy? Not measurable. When you get this list of questions, you put them together in an instrument, sometimes a piece of paper, sometimes a website. That list of questions is called the questionnaire. It's not the survey is the process. The questionnaire is that instrument through which you collect your data. Your questions will usually fall into one of 2 categories, and you should really pick the categories. Now, it's okay to have some of both, but you need to decide which one you're going to emphasize, because it's going to determine the number of people that you can ask and the amount of time it's going to take for you to do the analysis. The first type of question is a closed-ended question. A closed-ended question means that you could give them options and they pick one. Or it might be that they give a number in response. How old are you? 37, right? Or how old are you? 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, and they check one. But there is one answer, one specific answer, right? Usually something like a multiple choice. When you do the multiple choice, you have those options. Those options must meet 2 important criteria. They must be exhaustive and they must be mutually exclusive. Exhaustive means that no one is going to be able to read that question and not find themselves in one of those categories. Mutually exclusive means that no one is going to read that question and say, gee, I really belong to 2 of these categories. So let's think for a moment. Let's say that you were asking the students whether they like daytime or nighttime or online classes. right? And that's what you say. Which kind of classes do you prefer? Daytime, nighttime, online. And you have a student who says, well, gee, it depends on the class. I think some classes would be fine online, but some classes I really have to have someone there to help me. Now, which one do they pick, right? You don't have an option for them. So that's not exhaustive. On the other hand, you may have the same student look at it a different way. They may say, well, gee, sometimes I like online and sometimes I like lecture. Can I check both of them? In that case, you have a problem that they're not mutually exclusive. So you have to frame your questions in ways that each person can pick one answer, but only one answer, right? Sometimes that's as easy as just saying online, lecture, or day, night, online, depends on the class, don't know, other, right? But you have to give them one that they can pick and no more than one. Those are close-ended questions. Now, open-ended questions are those questions where you let people talk. So you would be saying, describe the kind of class that you would like. Okay? And then they have a paragraph there. They can write what their answers are. Open-ended questions give you much more depth. They're going to bring up things that you probably didn't think about when you were putting the test together. That's not necessarily a good thing. If it's only one person who has this thing you didn't think about, you haven't really gained very much by that one response. Now, it could be that they're the only one who said it, but a lot of other people would have marked it if you had listed it as an option. That's true. But it's also possible that you end up with a lot of things that really don't apply to very many people. The other problem with an open-ended question is that it's a lot more complex to do the analysis. You have to read each question. You have to mark each question, and there are ways to do this. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about qualitative research, because that's basically what an open-ended question is. It's a qualitative question rather than a quantitative question, which closed-ended questions inevitably are. I will point out that for those of you in the daytime section, Holly Verhassel did mention that she has software to do that analysis if you want to include open-ended questions. For those of you in the nighttime class, unfortunately, I do not have that software. So if you want to do open-ended questions, you're welcome to. You guys are going to have to do the content analysis. Up to you. Another important consideration with question construction is that the questions have to be clear. Now that seems like a no-brainer, but it's actually very difficult. We know what we're saying, and when we are talking about it with each other, we don't just talk about it with words. We also share experiences. We've shared some classroom time together. We share body language. We communicate through a lot more than just the words. And on top of that, we're the ones writing the questions, so we know what they are supposed to mean. We know what we're trying to say. That doesn't mean that that's what the words we've put together actually say, right? Another time when this becomes a problem is that sometimes we end up asking about something that we really don't know very much about. Think for a minute. Those of you, I imagine several of you have had some level of military experience or you've had children, right? Imagine if you were taking a survey that was looking at those issues, but was written by someone who had never been in the military, or written by a group of students who had never had children. Do you really think that they would be looking at the same things that you might look at, or that they would use the same words that you would ask? Of course not. And when you read it, you would know it. You would know it because of the way they asked it, right? You would look at those questions and say, well, do they mean this or do they mean this? I don't understand what they're asking. To them, the questions are perfectly clear. So sometimes the problem is that we know what we're saying, and sometimes the problem is we don't know what we're saying. Another way that questions can be unclear, that's very difficult for the person writing the questions to identify, is that the questions are ambiguous. They could mean more than one thing, right? If you read it one way, it means one thing. If you read it another way, it means a whole different thing. Sometimes you are operationalizing things in a way that's not normal. So when we're trying to estimate, for example, how far you are into your academic career, we might say, what is your standing? Are you a freshman, a sophomore, a junior, or a senior, right? But what if we said, have you had 15 hours, 30 hours, 45 hours, 60 hours, 75 hours, 90 hours? A lot of people would really have to stop and think for a little bit. They might know that they're a junior, but not know exactly how many hours they have taken, right? And so you need to, as much as possible, use the operationalizations that people are used to seeing. When you try to introduce something a little bit different, even if you think it would make it easier for you, it's going to make it harder on your respondents. And that means you're going to get fewer complete surveys. And your data is not going to be accurate because it will create confusion and people will mark it wrong. Sometimes it's just bad wording. Sometimes you just look at surveys and wonder if anyone ever bothered to read what they were handing out. And here's an example. This came out of an actual survey. Does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? I don't know what that means. I have been teaching this class for 2 years. I still haven't figured out what that question is asking. And I can't imagine anyone who's taking the survey really knew what it was asking either. So just read them carefully. Now, I'm going to warn you right now that we're going to go over some other problems with questions. But these ideas of the questions being clear are going to affect a lot of your questions. When you all put your survey together, you're going to put a lot of time into writing those questions. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to make you rewrite a lot of them because I'm going to say they're not clear. Please don't take offense to that. I am not being mean. It takes practice. It is really hard to begin to see a question the way that someone who hasn't seen it before will see it. It's hard. And I am not picking on you. I'm doing what every good researcher does for their friends because questions are hard to write. And this is one of the big reasons. We think we know what we're saying, we don't. Another thing that you should be careful about is that you do not include double-barreled questions. Double-barreled questions are questions where you're really asking more than one thing. And so if you're the one taking the survey, sometimes it's impossible to answer. So here's some examples. Please tell me whether you would vote for or against a candidate who supports reducing federal spending on education and welfare. Well, the first part is pretty articulate, pretty detailed. But what if you would vote for someone who would vote on education and against someone who would vote for reducing welfare, right? What if you see one way and one the other way? You can't answer this question then, right? Or, well, let me back up here. Some books will say that the way you catch double-barreled questions is to look for conjunctions. Conjunctions are words like and, or, but, however, therefore, right? Words that take two different phrases and join them. Conjunction. You can have a double-barreled question without them. In fact, the worst double-barreled questions frequently do not have conjunctions. So if someone tells you that, don't trust it. Okay? An example of a double-barreled question without a conjunction is, how long have you been beating your wife? You're really asking two questions. One, do you beat your wife? Two, how long have you been doing it? If you have never beaten your wife, and I hope you have never done that, you can't answer the question, right? So be careful with double-barreled questions. Another problem is that sometimes people ask questions that their respondents are just not competent to answer. It doesn't mean that their respondents are somehow dumb. It means that maybe they don't have that information. For example, if you wanted to ask students questions about the budget for the university, well, most students have never seen the university's budget. They may think they know how much is spent or that we spend too much on one thing or another, but they have no knowledge of the budget, and so you can't ask about it. Another way that we get into problems that are really the same thing is that sometimes we ask people to remember things that they probably can't really remember. How did you feel on the first day of school? Well, I don't know about you guys. For many of you, that was a lot more recently than my first day of school. But I don't think very many of us can actually remember how we felt that day, right? And unfortunately, people will try to answer these questions. They will rely on what they think is fact, even if it's not factual. They'll actually create memories. There's a lot of research that shows that. They'll convince themselves, yeah, this is how I felt that first day, even though they really don't remember. So be very careful that you're asking questions that people actually are capable of answering. You also have to be careful not to ask questions that people might not feel comfortable answering, even if they're capable of doing so. People are very hesitant to answer questions about things like money or sex or political opinions. Now, I don't think any of those are going to show up on either of your surveys. If you think about putting them in there, I'm going to probably tell you to take them out because it's not really pertinent to the research questions that we have at hand. But putting them in a survey in any case is going to really challenge the trust and confidence that your respondents have in you. And it's going to affect how they answer all of the other questions. So if you have to ask these questions, go ahead and do so, but work very hard and be very careful. Do not ask them unless you absolutely have to. Questions on any survey need to be relevant. Sometimes you'll see surveys where people do fishing expeditions. They go out there and they try to collect data that they think might be interesting. Maybe it's sort of related. You don't want to do that. You want what's called face validity. When people take the survey, You want them to understand what it is that you're looking at. All of the questions you have on there need to make sense to your respondents. That's how you build that trust so that they continue and complete the survey and do it honestly and accurately. Whenever possible, make your questions as short as possible. Do not put one word in there that doesn't have to be there. Read back over those questions as many times as it takes. Get every extra word out of there. Now, having said that, if the only way to make a question shorter is to make the words more complicated, sometimes an extra word is okay. You should also avoid any kind of negative item. Now, negative doesn't mean downer. Negative means forms of the word no. No, not, never, none. Any of those kinds of things. Try never to put those in your questions. For some reason, people get confused. Often they don't even read the no, and so they answer your question backwards, okay? In no case at all will I allow you to include a question with a double negative. So if you have a question and there's no way around it, we have to put a negative in there, a no, a not, a none, that's fine. But there's only going to be one, because when you get two in a sentence, it stops making sense. Okay. Make sure that your questions avoid bias. And it's very easy to slip bias into a question, even when that's not what you mean. But bias is any little thing that encourages the respondent to answer the question one way instead of another. Now, when Holly presented to the AM class, she gave a beautiful example of this. She said, if I include a question that says, my favorite color, is your favorite color red, yellow, or green? Well, if your favorite color is blue, what you're going to do is answer red, blue, or green, or red, yellow, or green, because the question has primed you that way. And that's how the human mind works. But that's not what we want, right? So be careful that your questions don't encourage any single answer. So look for phrases that include those kind of like, don't you agree that? Don't you think that? In your opinion, isn't. Okay, so don't do those. Try to avoid references to prestigious people or agencies, right? Think about any kind of hypothetical setting that you give. They'll say, if you were to face a situation where you had to drop out of school, where would you go? Now, sometimes we have to include those, but try to avoid those as much as you can, because once again, they can induce bias. Be careful that you do not use gendered terms. So don't use he, her, his, okay? Use gender neutral terms. Finally, your lexicon has to be very carefully unbiased. And this is sometimes difficult to do. It really is. But if you look at slide 16, what I have are two different columns. And in each row, I have two words or phrases that have been used to refer to exactly the same thing. But if I use them both in surveys, those on the left will get more support than those on the right. So if I say, do you support assistance to the poor? People will say yes. Do you support welfare? They'll say no. Do you support solving the problems of big cities? They'll say yes. They'll say, do you support assistance to big cities? They'll say no. So be very careful. Look at these, and sometimes these just slide in because they are so very difficult to identify. Bounce these off of each other. Talk about your questions and make yourself think about this. Now, you are going to be doing this online, and that's really good. It's a nice way to protect confidentiality, and it is a time saver. But a lot of questionnaires are actually done on paper. When you're doing them on paper, layout is extremely important. In fact, even the paper that you use is extremely important. One of the mistakes that a lot of people make is trying to put too much information on one page. Yes, it is good if your questionnaire is only one page, but if the type is too small or it's too cramped together, it starts looking squashed and crowded and hard to read. People are less likely to complete it than if you make it a 2-page survey. Make it easy to read. Use things like arrows or white space. White space is just blank space on the page. Use those to help move the eye across the page. Now, the master of this kind of research is a man named Don Tillman, and I actually have several of his books that include information on internet surveys that I'm going to put on the reserve shelf in the library. I encourage you to use those books, and they will be down there on Monday. When you're doing a paper questionnaire, be sure to use boxes for selecting responses. With the advent of the internet, people are getting used to the idea that round boxes mean you can only select one, and square boxes mean you can select more than one. And so a lot of people are beginning to use those cues, and I highly recommend it if you're ever putting a questionnaire together. But don't use just blanks or ask them to circle the numbers. Use a shape and have them mark it. I also highly encourage you to consider using what are called branching or contingency questions, or I have seen them referred to as bridging questions. In any place, these are the questions where you say things like, have you ever smoked marijuana? Yes or no? If yes, then do this, and if no, then do this. So you can separate and direct people to the correct place. That way, if the answer is no, you don't have to read the next 3 questions because they don't apply to you. And your respondents are going to appreciate that, and it makes it easier for you in the long run, actually. I'm also going to very, 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 very strongly recommend that you use matrix questions. You can see these on slide 21. Matrix questions are where you are actually asking 6 or 8 questions, but you use a format that makes it look like one question. And so you can get a lot more information out of your respondents without them feeling like they've answered a whole lot of questions. It's really kind of magical how well this can work. These work especially well if you have things like Likert type scales, from 1 to 5, or something along that line. Once you have all of your questions put together, it's not enough just to put them on paper or online, because your questionnaire, your survey, needs to run like a conversation. And conversations don't go from one random idea to another random idea. What you want to do is make the people talk to you. Your job is to hear them, and so you want them to talk. And when people talk, there's an order. Your job in constructing that survey is to predict what the order should be, the way that conversation would normally flow, and to put the questions in that order, okay? It's especially important because sometimes one question will affect the mood or the focus of the respondent. If you ask about something that they have really strong feelings about, or something that might have an emotional reaction, the questions after that are going to be affected. And so you have to identify those key questions and put them in an order so that the rest of your data is still usable and still reliable. Sometimes you should also consider randomizing the order of your answers. I don't think either group is going to have a big enough N that this would be worth a lot of the time, but it's something to keep in mind. It's a good idea if you have, let's say, 100 questions, to have maybe 4 different versions of your questionnaire and break them up so that the first 25 questions are different. One group gets one group of 25, second group of subjects gets a different first 25 questions. The reason is now you can compare those. And if the answers in one group are vastly different from the answers in a different group, maybe your subjects were just getting tired taking your survey, and they started answering for their convenience and not for being honest. Or maybe there was a question somewhere that was affecting the way they were answering those questions, and you can identify those if you start randomizing the order. You should also make sure that your questions are not all pointed in the same direction. This means, let's say we had a matrix with questions about different characteristics of classes. And the question is, how much do you like it when people do blah, right? So 1 is you like it not at all, and 5 is you like it a lot. And you say things like, use overhead transparencies, use online videos. If it's all use this, use this, use this, use this, there are going to be people who just start marking 4 without thinking about it. This is one time when using negatives is good. So you have some of them that say, I use overhead transparencies, or I use video clips, or I use music, and one that says, does not use. So now they have to flip it. They have to think about the questions. They have to slow down just a little bit. Actually makes the questionnaire more usable sometimes. When you're doing a survey instrument, a questionnaire on paper, you should end the conversation with demographics. You should begin it with an explanation of what it is that you're doing and some sort of thank you. We appreciate you doing this. We're going to use this data in this way, and this way, and this way. And then you should go right into some of the questions. You can start with some of the more mundane, easier, simpler, kind of wade into the heavier stuff, but you should end with the demographics. And here's why. You've all had those surveys, right? And they start off and they make it sound like it's really important, and then the first thing they ask you is, are you a man or a woman? How old are you? Right? Well, by the time you answer those, any kind of interest that you had in the survey has been squashed. It's boring now. You don't want that. So put the boring stuff at the end and then say thank you again. That's good conversational flow when it's on paper. But it's not necessarily the same in other formats. It's one of the small differences. Okay? When you're doing, just a couple more comments about when you're doing a survey on paper. When you're doing the questionnaire on paper, make sure you include instructions, especially if you're not going to be there to help them. Make sure you have clear constructions. Make sure you have transitions from one section to another. It's perfectly fine to say, we're going to ask you a few questions now about what happens inside the classroom. Now we're going to ask you a few questions about the process of enrolling and choosing classes. Now we're going to ask you some questions about clubs that you might belong to. Great. Tell them what you're getting ready to do. Include those transitions. It's part of the conversation. And of course, end with a thank you. And don't just say thank you at the bottom. Make it a couple of sentences. Thank you for your help. We appreciate your time. We're going to be using these in making decisions for the school, right? Give them a little bit more. When you send out questionnaires, if they're printed questionnaires and you're actually sending them in the mail, don't just send the questionnaire. Actually send a note to say it's coming, then send the questionnaire, then send a reminder or two, and send a thank you after they return the questionnaire. Always hand address your envelope, and always include a stamped pre-addressed envelope. Do not make them write down the address for you, and do not make them pay for the stamp. Okay? Now, mailed surveys, those are becoming dinosaurs very quickly. Your book talks a little bit about tracking the surveys when they come back and identifying patterns in those. That can be very useful too. But as I said, mailed paper surveys are becoming dinosaurs. And instead, what we're getting into more and more today are electronic surveys, which I know is what you all are a little bit more interested in. But there are a couple of issues that cover both of those. One of those is response rate, and one of those is compensation. Response rates can be surprisingly low. A lot of students think that they're going to put together a survey and 95% of the students are going to answer that survey. No, they aren't. They just aren't. Rates of survey completion in a lot of research, they seem to be going down. We're getting tired of being surveyed. There are people who can put together surveys so beautifully that they get amazing response rates. Don Tillman, who wrote the books that I said I would have in the library for you, has been known to get 60 to 75% response rates in some of his surveys. Just amazing, amazing that anyone can do that. In the surveys that you all are doing, if you get 15 or 20%, we are going to be tickled pink. Okay, so don't set your sights too high. We will be looking at some analysis to see, though, if the people who respond kind of match our population. If we find out that, for example, everyone who responds is male, we won't be able to generalize from your survey response to the student body, right? So we're going to do some checking, but don't expect a huge number. The other question is compensation. Now, compensation does help, and there is recent research that shows people are reaching the point where they almost expect some kind of compensation. There is, though, also research that compensation affects how people respond, and so you could be introducing bias. So one of the things that people have started doing is giving compensation right up front. If I invite you to participate in a survey, and as part of that invitation, you get a couple of dollars. It doesn't have to be big, just a small compensation. That actually encourages participation and has almost no effect on responses. So that's what most people are trying to move to today. The other thing that you see quite often is enrollment in a drawing if you participate. If there is any kind of compensation in these, I imagine that's something that you all are thinking about. And that one can also work because the way they answer the question is perceived as having no effect on whether or not they get that compensation. Now, sometimes surveys are done as interview surveys. And in this case, they literally are a conversation. They actually do sit down and talk. Interview surveys can be much less formal. The questions can vary a little bit from person to person, primarily because we can use what are called probing questions. So if someone says, have you ever had trouble getting into the class that you wanted to? You say yes or no, right? Well, we could do that on a questionnaire, and we can do that in an interview survey. And if they say yes, on a printed questionnaire or an internet questionnaire, we might say, was that because of, and list 5 or 6 things, right? And we could do that same thing in a conversation, in an interview, right? But let's say that they said, well, yeah, I guess it was number 4. In an interview, we can say, you don't sound real sure about that. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? And we can get some depth of information that we wouldn't get in a printed questionnaire or an internet questionnaire, right? We can also begin with those to pick up on other things. Sometimes you will see interview surveys that include comments by the interviewer about whether people seemed nervous or whether people seemed clean or some of these other kinds of characteristics depending upon what the survey was looking at. We can also, in interview surveys, clarify misunderstandings. So there may be less of a chance of erroneous responses. Babby gives you some advice if you ever do an interview survey or an interview of any kind. And for the most part, I think it's pretty good advice. But he does say one thing that I want to talk about very briefly. He says to dress in the same way that your respondents dress. Now, that can be a good thing if you can pull it off and look kind of sincere, but don't put yourself in a costume. If you're dressing in a way that's very foreign and fake, your respondents will know it, okay? So there's a fine line there. Basically, when you costume, there's a bit of almost disrespect sometimes. So be careful about that, but be clean. The big one is to be clean and be prepared. If you have 1 pencil, take 3. Don't take 1 pad of paper, take at least 2. If you take a video recorder, take batteries. Take a backup recorder, right? Do not begin recording a respondent ever, ever, ever until you have gotten a signed consent form that includes the stipulation that you will be recording them. And that stipulation should specify whether it will be audio recording or video recording or audio video recording, right? When you do get into interviews, that's when you have the biggest completion rate, 80 to 85%. People will participate in those, especially if you add something like CAPI, which is a method where we actually use computers during those interviews. The rates can be very high, but they become very time intensive. And one of the benefits of a survey is that you can get responses from a large number of people in a short amount of time and for a very small amount of money. So there's a big trade-off when you move into the interviews. Telephone surveys, like paper questionnaires, are kind of a dying breed. They were very important for a long time, but they're becoming much less popular today because they're becoming much less reliable. Today we have things like caller ID, we have cell phones, we have answering machines, and technology is allowing people to screen their calls very easily. And very few people are accepting the phone calls from people who are conducting surveys. In the end, you have people who are very different from the general population who do complete the surveys, and so your findings are really not reliable or valid. Online surveys, as you all will be doing, on the other hand, are growing in use. They're becoming much more popular, and the reliability of them is being supported. For a long time, people did not trust online surveys. They do now. And you having this particular training in doing a scientific online survey is going to serve you well. Now, having said that, there are still some populations that are going to be underrepresented on online surveys. There is still a technological divide. Some people don't have computers. They tend to be poor. Those who do have computers and are poor are more likely to have a dial-up connection rather than a streaming kind of connection. So there are still some limitations. The response rates are about the same as they were for printed questionnaires. And for the most part, the answers are relatively similar, which is one reason that we're really moving now to the online surveys. You should be ready for any kind of technological issue. Now, fortunately, in this setting, you're not the ones in IT, and you don't really have to work with IT because IT already has all of this set up. They already monitor it. But there is always the possibility that the day after we launch this, those servers will go down. And you just have to know that that is a possibility. Okay. Now, there's a lot more to talk about with surveys. I encourage you right now to spend some time working on some questions, share them with one another, review them, be honest, and be picky. Okay? Look at them and be a tough judge. And then next week when we're in class, we'll go over them one more time. See you then.